Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'd also just like to remind everyone that we're talking about territories that are in tropical climate and that these are tri-island territories. I hear people talk about Puerto Rico as though it's a monolith. There's also Vieques and there's Coyoba. There's also 3 islands with respect to the U.S. Virgin Islands, and that is St. John, St. Thomas, and St. Croix. So I don't want us to see this as a monolith because each of these islands have their own identity, their own inhabitants, and I'm not hearing enough of a deep enough dive into what is happening with the inhabitants of all of these territories, because it's not one singular event. It's an event that hit 3 separate geographic territories. I'm putting that out there because I'm going to want to hear more about what has happened in terms of response to those territories. We're not hearing at all about how the people of St. John are receiving health care, the people of Vieques are receiving health care. We're not hearing that information, and that is just as important. I'd like to start my question about the evacuation process. What assistance was provided to prepare and implement an adequate and efficient evacuation plan for those whose health are compromised? And was there coordination assistance provided to the local health departments in the wake of the hurricanes to track evacuees who were sent to other islands and or the mainland?
Ma'am, I can probably address that in deference to your question. I would also just highlight our map that we provided, which identifies where HHS is basically providing augmentation support to St. John as well as St. Croix and Virgin Islands. And also we had a presence on Vieques as well. But to your point about evacuation, again, for the complexity of this event, and again, Irma struck St. Thomas first, and for which we were doing some unprecedented things using CMS's Empower database. We actually were able to send in our DMAT teams with Urban Search and Rescue and identify dialysis patients on the island, for which we recovered 120 of them and then evacuated them to relative safety in Puerto Rico until Maria hit, at which point in time we evacuated them literally the day of landfall of Maria, and evacuated those patients to Miami, to a medical shelter there where we could ensure that they were being cared for. In the cases of other patients who were evacuated from the Virgin Islands, they were evacuated through Atlanta, and again, receiving care through there, through local resources. And so throughout, the intent here is not only did we evacuate those dialysis patients, but sent them with a non-medical attendant, a family member, so they would have someone to assist them along the way. At the present time, there's only been a handful of, would say, evacuations off the island to the mainland. There were 2 pediatric patients, intensive care patients, that were evacuated from San Juan to Miami soon after landfall. But what we've tried to do is basically maintain the health infrastructure on Puerto Rico because we're hopeful that those people get better and they need to be closer to family and support units there. So the way we address the problem in Puerto Rico is we created these 7 regional hubs of hospitals that we augmented with our disaster medical assistant teams. We took the benefit of a level 1 trauma center in Central Medico in San Juan, where we made it one, if you will, the Eastern hub, a receiving hospital for high acuity or intensive care patients, and then used the USS Comfort as the other hub, the Western hub, a little mobile hub that we could basically run from from the top of there in Arecibo down to Ponce to collect patients depending on their acuity as required, and then have been able to use DoD assets, both ground ambulances and medevac dust-off helicopters to provide response on the island, and then using naval medical assets and rotary wing and fixed wing assets to fly them.
If there is a document that you have that just sort of outlines all
yes,
of
ma'am.
that, that would be great if you could provide
I can
it
make
to
that
the,
available
to the
you
committee. I also wanted to talk about the public health challenges of these island territories. the islands will need the assistance of the federal government in the weeks, months, and years to come. What is the agency's position of the Medicaid cap as it relates to the Virgin Islands with its already limited resources? And do you support a full federal contribution as the federal government did for Katrina?
And I'll defer to Ms. Brandt.
Thank you for that question. That is certainly something that we are looking at, and we are exploring whether or not we would have the flexibility to do that. But the federal map is set by Congress. It's a statutory.
Yeah, I'm asking about your recommendation. Right now, you have these islands, right? Island territories where, in one case, the U.S. Virgin Islands, their major employment is through tourism, right? No one's working. So are we requiring that government to come up with a match, or are we going to suspend it and do a full federal contribution as we did for Katrina on the mainland?
Excuse me for not answering directly. We are pursuing that. We are working with the Office of Management and Budget to pursue that with congressional approval.
Wonderful, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.